Somewhere out there right now, a field is being planted for the last time, and no one standing on it knows it. The farmer will work it the way he always has. Watch the crop come up green, bring in the harvest, and plan for next year the way farmers always do. But the water that field runs on is almost gone, and it is a kind of water that does not come back. When the last of it is pumped, that field will not simply rest for a season and recover. It will not lie fallow, waiting for better times. It will stop growing food, and it will never grow food again. Not next year, not in 100 years, not in the lifetime of anyone's descendants for a very long time to come. That green field, so ordinary and so alive, is quietly living through its final harvests, and the ground beneath it is on a countdown to a single, literal last drop. Most people have a comforting idea about groundwater. They imagine it like a bank account that refills, an underground supply that the rain tops back up, so that if you pump it down, it will fill again given time. For some shallow aquifers, in wet places, that is roughly true. But under many of the world's most important farmlands, it is completely false, and that false belief is one of the most dangerous misunderstandings in the modern world. The water under those fields is not being refilled in any meaningful way. It is ancient, laid down over tens of thousands of years during ice ages and wetter epochs long gone. And it recharges today at a rate so slow it is effectively zero. Pumping it is not like drawing from a renewing well. It is like mining coal or pumping oil, extracting a finite deposit that took a geological age to form and that, once removed, is gone on any timescale that matters to human beings. We even have a name for it: fossil water. And a huge share of the food the world eats is grown by mining that fossil water out of the ground and spreading it on fields that could never have supported those crops on rainfall alone. So this is a story about the most unsettling fact in all of modern agriculture, that some of our most productive fields are not really farms in the sustainable sense at all. They are mines, extracting a one-time deposit of ancient water, and they have a fixed amount of it, and a burn rate, and therefore an end. It is a story about the last drop, the moment the deposit runs out, and about the fields that, when that moment comes, will cross a line from which there is no return, and simply cease, forever, to be places where food can grow. Because the hardest truth about fossil water is not that it is running out, it is what it leaves behind when it does. It is worth pausing to really feel how old this water is, because the timescales involved are what make the loss so absolute. When you pump fossil water onto a field, you are lifting up rain and snowmelt that fell on the land during the last ice age and the wet periods around it. Water that has been sitting in the dark, deep underground for something like 10,000, 20,000, in some places far more than 100,000 years. It fell when mammoths still walked the earth, when the great ice sheets were only beginning to retreat, long before anyone planted the first seed, long before cities or writing or any of the things we call history. It seeped slowly down through the rock over millennia and pooled in the porous ground and waited there, untouched, through the entire rise of human civilization, until we drilled down and began to pull it out in the last 100 years to grow corn and cotton and wheat. To recharge an aquifer like that, to put the water back, would take a return of those ancient wetter climates and then tens of thousands of years of slow seepage, which is simply not going to happen on any timeline that means anything to us or to the next 1,000 generations. So when we say the water will never come back, we are not exaggerating for effect. We are describing the literal truth of a resource that took an ice age to create and that we are draining in the span of a few human lifetimes. We are spending, in a century, an inheritance that took the earth longer than the whole span of our species to accumulate. Let me take you to the last harvest, because it does not look like an ending at all. Picture a farm out on a great dry plain over one of these ancient aquifers on a late summer day. The crop is in, golden and heavy, and it looks like every other good year. The farmer is the third or fourth generation to work this ground, and his family has always pumped water from below to grow here, because the rain alone was never enough. But the wells have been getting weaker for years. Each one has been drilled deeper than the last, chasing the water table down as it falls, and this year, the deepest well he can afford is starting to cough and pull air, the water down there thinning toward nothing. He knows, in the back of his mind, what that means, though he does not quite let himself say it. There is no deeper to go that makes any economic sense. The deposit under his land, the fossil water his family has lived on for generations, is nearly spent. This harvest, or the next, or the one after, will be among the last, and then the pumps will pull up nothing but sand, and the fields will go quiet. It will not feel like a catastrophe on the day it happens. It will feel like a bad year, and then another, and then a decision to stop. But it is not a bad year. It is the bottom of a well that took the last ice age to fill and a single lifetime to empty, and when it is dry, the harvests do not pause. They end. To understand why the last drop is a real, countable thing, you have to grasp that these aquifers are finite deposits with a measurable bottom, because fossil water does not refill. An aquifer full of it behaves exactly like any other finite resource being extracted. There is a total amount in the ground. There is a rate at which it is being pumped out. And simple arithmetic tells you how long it lasts. Scientists studying these great aquifers can measure how much usable water remains and how fast it is declining. And they can and do produce estimates of how many years of pumping are left in a given area. And in the most heavily used regions, those numbers are not measured in centuries. They are measured in decades, or in some places, in years. There is a real, calculable date, region by region, when the water becomes too deep, too depleted, or too expensive to pump for farming, and after that date, the fields over it can no longer be irrigated from below. That is the last drop, not a metaphor, but an actual endpoint on a chart that the water level has been sliding toward for decades. And because different parts of these aquifers are being drained at different speeds, the last drop does not come everywhere at once. It comes field by field, farm by farm, county by county. A slow tide of exhaustion spreading across the plain, each place reaching its own final harvest on its own schedule, until the whole region has crossed over. Somewhere on that map, right now, a field is reaching its date. And somewhere else, one already has. And the final years before the last drop have a cruel quality to them, because they feel survivable right up until they are not, which keeps everyone from facing the ending until it arrives. As the water table falls, farmers do not simply give up. They adapt in ways that mask the decline and buy a little more time. They drill their wells deeper, chasing the water down at ever greater cost. They install more powerful pumps to lift it from further below. They switch to crops that need less water, accepting smaller returns to keep going. And each of these adjustments works, for a while, so that from year to year the farm keeps producing, and the crisis never quite announces itself, hidden behind the ingenuity of people determined to hold on. But every one of those adaptations is a step closer to the bottom, not a way around it. The deeper wells reach water that is not only scarcer, but often saltier and dirtier, harder on the crops and the soil. The costs climb until farming barely pays. And all the while, the actual amount of water left keeps shrinking towards zero, regardless of how cleverly it is being chased. So the final chapter of a fossil water field is not a sudden cliff, but a long, deceptive slope. A decade or two of making do, of drilling deeper and spending more and growing a little less, that feels like managing the problem right up until the moment the water simply is not there at any depth or any price, and the managing abruptly becomes an ending. The adaptations do not prevent the last drop. They just make sure no one quite sees it coming until it has come. Now here is the part that separates this from an ordinary shortage, the part that makes never the honest word. When the fossil water is gone, the field does not just lose its irrigation. It loses the possibility of ever being farmed that way again. Think about what the end of the water actually means for that ground. The aquifer that fed it is not coming back because it does not recharge. So there is simply no more water down there to return to, not in any human time frame, not for thousands of years. That alone would be enough to make the loss permanent. But it is worse than that, because the act of draining the aquifer often damages the land above it in ways that are themselves irreversible. In many places, pulling the water out causes the ground to compact and sink, permanently destroying the underground space that once held water, so that even the theoretical future refill has nowhere to go. On the surface, decades of irrigation leave behind accumulated salts that the water is no longer there to flush away, poisoning the soil. The living biology of the soil, deprived of moisture and crops, dies back towards sterility. So a field that has run out of fossil water is not a thirsty field waiting for a drink. It is a field whose water source has permanently vanished, whose ground may have collapsed, whose soil may have turned salty and dead, sitting in a dry climate where the rain was never enough to farm on in the first place, which is the entire reason the fossil water was needed to begin with. Take away the one thing that made farming possible there, permanently, and you do not get a resting farm. You get a return to the barren, marginal land that existed before the pumping started, except more damaged, and this time with no buried treasure of ancient water left to awaken it again. The field does not fall asleep. It dies and stays dead. And people always want to believe that technology will simply solve this, that we will find a way to bring water to these fields once the aquifer is gone, but the scale defeats every version of that hope. Farming does not use a little water. It uses staggering ocean-like volumes of it, spread across millions of acres, and that is the problem that breaks every proposed rescue. Desalination, turning seawater into fresh, is expensive and energy-hungry enough that it can make sense for a coastal city's drinking supply, but the numbers become absurd when you try to irrigate thirsty crops with it far inland, hundreds of miles from any sea and often uphill. Piping in water from wetter regions runs into the fact that those regions increasingly need their own, and into costs and distances that no crop could ever repay. And none of it addresses the deeper problem, that even if you somehow delivered water to a field whose aquifer had collapsed and whose soil had turned to salt, you would be watering damaged, sunken, sterile ground in a place the climate never meant to be farmed. The fossil water was not just a convenience. It was a one-time, irreplaceable subsidy from the deep past, delivered for free by geology to exactly the right place, in exactly the volumes farming needs, and nothing we can build reproduces that at the price and the scale required. There is no machine that makes an aquifer. When the ancient water is gone, the thing that made the field possible is gone with it. And no amount of technology fills the hole, because the hole is the size of an ice age. And if that sounds like a grim prediction about the future, understand that it is not a prediction at all, because the ghost fields already exist. This is not a hypothetical warning about what might someday happen. There are already places on Earth where the fossil water ran out and the fields went permanently silent. In parts of the Middle East, ambitious efforts to grow crops by pumping ancient desert aquifers succeeded spectacularly for a while, turning desert green, and then drained those non-renewing aquifers within a single generation. After which the fields were simply abandoned, the green squares fading back to desert, the water gone for good. In the oldest farming regions of the world, in the lands where agriculture itself began, there are grounds that were farmed into ruin by salt and exhaustion thousands of years ago and have never fully recovered since. And across the great plains and valleys of the modern world, there are already fields that have been forced out of irrigated production as the water beneath them failed, reverting to dryland scrub or bare, cracked ground. These are the ghost fields, the places that have already reached their last drop, and they are the proof, written on the real map, that this ending is real and that it is permanent. When people say the fields will never grow food again, they are not speculating. They are describing something that has already happened in more than one place, and that is now beginning to happen across some of the most important farmland on the planet. And this points to the most profound and unsettling way to understand the whole situation, which is that much of the modern world has been eating a one-time harvest. Consider what we have actually been doing. We found vast deposits of ancient water under some of the driest, most marginal land on Earth, and we used that water to grow enormous quantities of food on ground that could never have supported it otherwise. For several generations, that has produced a spectacular abundance, cheap grain, cheap meat, overflowing harvests from places that, by nature, are near deserts. But that abundance was never renewable. It was and is a one-time event, the conversion of a finite, ancient, unrepeatable deposit of water into food, a bloom of plenty that will last exactly as long as the fossil water does, and not one season longer. We have been living, in effect, off an inheritance, a buried gift of water from the deep past, and spending it as though it were income. When it is gone, and the fields it awakened will go back to sleep, permanently, because the thing that woke them was a one-time deposit that will not be replenished. Future generations will not be able to repeat what we did, because the water we are using up will not be there for them. We are the generations that got to spend the fossil water, and the fields we are draining now are giving humanity a harvest that can never be given again. One final crop from ground that will then fall silent for a span of time longer than recorded history. And the scale of what is at stake is enormous, because this is not happening on a few odd fields in obscure corners. It is happening under the breadbaskets of the world. The great aquifers being mined for fossil water sit beneath some of the most productive agricultural regions on the planet, and together they help feed a substantial share of humanity. Under the plains of North America, the enormous aquifer that turned dry grassland into a machine for growing grain and raising cattle is being drawn down, with large areas already measured in decades or less of remaining water. Beneath the farms of northern India and northern China, aquifers are being depleted at some of the fastest rates on Earth, propping up the food supply of well over 1 billion people on water that is running out. In the deserts of the Middle East and North Africa, ancient reserves have been tapped and, in places, already exhausted. Add it all together, and a meaningful fraction of the world's food is being grown right now by mining fossil water that has a finite end, which means that a meaningful fraction of the world's fields are on the same countdown, heading toward the same last drop, destined for the same permanent silence. This is not a local problem for a few unlucky farmers. It is a structural feature of how the modern world feeds itself, a vast, unrepeatable drawdown of ancient water spread across the planet's key growing regions, all of it temporary, much of it already well advanced, and every acre of it on its way eventually to becoming a field that will never grow food again. And behind every one of these fields is a family, which means the end of the fossil water is also the end of a long human story told for the last time. On the Great Plains and in the dry valleys, there are families who have farmed the same ground for 4, 5, 6 generations, whose entire identity and history is bound to that piece of land and the water beneath it. The grandfather learned it from his father and taught it to his son, a deep, specific knowledge of how this exact ground behaves, passed down like an heirloom. And the generation farming it now, as the water runs out, carries a terrible knowledge the others never had, that they are the last link in that chain, that there will be no handing down of this land as a living farm. Because the thing that made it a farm is disappearing on their watch. Their children will not inherit fields to work, but exhausted ground to walk away from. A century or more of a family's relationship with a place, of weddings and funerals and harvests and hard winters, all rooted in that soil, comes to an end not because the family failed, but because the buried water that made it all possible was always going to run out, and it happened to run out for them. When the last drop is pumped, it is not only a field that goes silent, it is a way of life, a body of knowledge, and a bond between people and a specific patch of the earth, all ending together, and none of it coming back any more than the water does. So what does it actually mean to lose a field forever when you multiply it across all of that ground? It means a permanent, one-directional reduction in the planet's capacity to feed itself, arriving not all at once, but relentlessly, region by region, as the fossil water gives out. It means that some of the most productive farmland humanity has ever known will pass out of production for good. Not to be replaced, because the conditions that made it productive, the ancient water, cannot be recreated. It means higher food prices and greater scarcity in a world that will have more mouths to feed even as this happens. And it means something harder to measure, a kind of inheritance in reverse, the passing down to future generations not of fertile fields, but of exhausted, silent ground. Land that fed their ancestors abundantly and will feed them nothing, its buried gift of water already spent by the people who came before. Good farmland is one of the rarest and most precious things on earth, taking nature ages to create, and here we are converting vast tracts of it into permanent wasteland in the span of a few generations. In exchange for a temporary flood of cheap food that felt while it lasted like it would never end. The fields that will never grow food again are not just an agricultural statistic. They are a subtraction from the fundamental wealth of the world, a closing of doors that will not reopen, a diminishment of what the earth can do for us, chosen, mostly without anyone deciding it. One emptied aquifer at a time. Stand at the edge of one of these fields on a good year, the crop tall and green and heavy, the sprinklers turning, and everything about it says permanence, abundance, a scene that has always been and always will be. But listen to the pumps and understand what they are doing. They are lifting up water that fell as rain when the world was a different place. Water that has been waiting in the dark for tens of thousands of years, and pouring it out onto the surface to be used once and lost. And there is a bottom to that reservoir, A real one, closer now than anyone wants to believe, and when the pumps finally reach it, this green and living field will begin its long journey back to the dry and silent ground it was before we woke it. Except this time, there will be no ancient water left beneath it to ever wake it again. Somewhere out there, the last drop is already being pumped from some field's final well, and that ground has just grown its last meal for the human race. It will not be the last. Field by field, aquifer by aquifer, the great one-time harvest of the fossil water is ending, and behind it, spreading quietly across the breadbaskets of the world, comes the silence of fields that fed us once magnificently and will never, ever feed us again. We were handed a gift older than our species, a buried ocean of water saved up across an ice age, and we chose to spend it in a few generations on cheap and abundant food, without ever quite admitting to ourselves that it could only be spent once. The bill for that choice is not paid in money, it is paid in fields, one at a time, going dark forever, handed down to the future not as farms, but as scars. And the last drop, when it comes for each of them, makes no sound at all. It is simply the moment a well pulls up air on an ordinary afternoon, on ground that has just fed the human race for the final time.